Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be looking into the history of another one of my favourite guitar companies, Fender. Now, as was the case with my previous video on PRS guitars, I'm not going to be able to cover every single model that the company's ever released, but I will do my best to give you the history of the most important models as well as everything that's in the current lineup. So, starting at the beginning, on August the 10th, 1909, when Clarence Leo Fender is born in Anaheim, California. After graduating from high school, Leo would run a local radio station, and it was at this point where he was building amps and PA systems. In 1938 he would open his first repair shop, and in 1946 he would rename the company to the Fender Electric Instruments Company. By 1949, Fender amps such as the Woody amp would become established staples in the music industry. In 1950 we see the first electric guitar. Prior to this he had built lap steels, but 1950 saw the first model that we would recognise as a Fender, that being the Esquire. Now, early Esquires came as both single and double pickup models, but they didn't have a truss rod in the neck. A truss rod was then added and the model was renamed to the Broadcaster. However, Gretsch didn't like this as they had a drum kit by the same name, although the name of the drum kit was spelt with a K. Either way, they still didn't like this, which forced Fender to rename the guitar the Telecaster. 1951 saw the invention of the first electric bass, that being the P-bass, and the first shape of the P-bass, which is more commonly known these days as the Telecaster bass. 1952 saw the introduction of the Tweed amps, including the Fender Twin and the Bassman. In 1954, Fender would introduce the Stratocaster. Interestingly, when the guitar first released, it only had a three-way selector switch. Now, you could get the famous in-between tones between the neck and middle and bridge. However, you had to do this by sort of jamming the three-way selector between the two positions. It wouldn't be until 23 years later, in 1977, the Strat would get the five-way blade switch that we know it as having today. In 1956, we get the short-scale Duosonic guitar. This would go through a couple of redesigns before being dropped in 1968, but then it would be reissued from 1993 onwards, and you can still buy them today. In 1958, the Jazzmaster is introduced at NAMM. It's produced until 1980, and then it's discontinued for 4 years, until in 1984, it's reintroduced. Now, this guitar was initially pitched, as the name would suggest, at jazz guitarists, although it gained more popularity initially in the surf rock community. 1959 would see the introduction of the first significant new version of the Telecaster. This model would feature a slab rosewood board as well as a double body binding, and be known as the Telecaster Custom. 1959 would also see the introduction of rosewood on the Stratocaster with the slab board necks. These would run until 1962, where they would change to the more familiar and still used to this day veneer board necks, which feature a thinner slice of rosewood on the top of the neck for the fretboard. 1960 saw the introduction of what was initially called the Deluxe bass, but we know it today, and the name was changed very shortly after, to the Jazz bass. Now, early 60 to 62 models feature controls such as this one. Now, I'm not lucky enough to own a 60s jazz bass, sadly, but this is my Mexican one, which I've modified to have the 60s style control layout. So you have two dual concentric pots with a volume and a tone for each of the pickups. This would change in 63 over to what is the more common three-knob design, having only a single tone pot. In 1962, the Fender Jaguar is introduced, looking very similar to the Jazzmaster, but having quite a different sound with its shielded single-coil pickups. In 1963, the Fender range of amps switched to what is known as the blackface design, and this would run up until 1967 or 68, depending on model. In 1964, Fender would begin producing acoustic guitars, and it was around this time, now with about 600 employees to the company, that Leo would begin to have health issues. He wanted to sell the company to his business partner, Don Randall, who was running Fender sales, but he couldn't afford to buy the company. In August of 1964, the Mustang is introduced, and on the 5th of January 1965, Fender is sold to a subsidiary of Columbia Broadcasting Systems, or CBS. 1966 would see the introduction of what is known as the 70s headstock, the deeper headstock compared to the thinner, narrower 60s pre-CBS headstock. 1968 would see the Fender range of amps switch over to the silver face design, and in 1972 the Tele Deluxe is introduced, with its wide space humbuckers attempting to compete with humbucker models such as the Les Paul. This would be produced up until 1981, with them then being reissued from 2004 onwards. In 1976, Fender's Starcaster is released. This is a hollow body guitar that was aimed at competing with guitars such as Gibson's ES335 and the Epiphone Casino. This was discontinued in 1982 before being reissued in 2013. In 1980, this oversized 70s style headstocks was abandoned, switching back to the 60s pre-CBS style headstock. In 1981, Fender's amps would switch over from the silver face design to the second series of blackface designs. In 1982, Fender Japan would start making guitars at the Fujigen factory. These would be made up until 1996, when they were replaced completely by the line of Mexican guitars. In the 1980s, Fender's reputation was dropping, and the company was beginning to lose money. CBS brought in Yamaha executives to try and turn the company around. One of these executives was William Schultz. On 1982, Schultz switches the Fender Focus to reissuing pre-CBS guitars, and in 1983 you started seeing the introduction of Japanese Squier guitars. On the 5th of March 1985, CBS would sell the company to Schultz, and the company is renamed to the Fender Musical Instruments Corporation. Although they did sell the company to Schultz, CBS did not sell many of the Fender patents, machinery, or the Fullerton factory, which were all sold separately. From 1985, due to these complications, Fender wouldn't produce any US-made models. The only Fenders being produced at this time were the ones being made in Japan. In 1987, after 2 years of no production in the US, they would open the custom shop in Corona, California. It was also in 1987 that the modern American Standard range of guitars that we knew up until the early 2010s would be released. And it would also be in this year that the factory in Ensenada, Mexico is opened. 1988 saw the first Artist Series models being released. The first artists to receive these were Eric Clapton and Yngwie Malmsteen. 1st of January 1991 saw the release of the first price list featuring Mexican-made guitars from the Ensenada factory opened a few years prior. It was at this point where these Mexican guitars would completely replace the Fender guitars being made in Japan. In 1991 they would move their headquarters from Corona to Arizona, and on the 21st of March 1991, sadly Leo Fender passed away, aged 82. In 1995, Fender would buy the Guild Guitar Company and then would sell it again in 2014. 1998 would see an 177,000 square foot facility being built in Corona, California. Autumn of 2002 would see Fender buy Jackson guitars from IMC, and in early 2003, a manufacturing and distribution deal with the Gretsch family would begin to start producing guitars under the Gretsch name. On October 28, 2007, Fender acquired the Canon Music Corporation, which includes brands such as Ovation, Charvel, and Hamer. In 2013, Fender would begin reissuing various amps, these including Tweed, Silver, and Blackface amps. 2016 would see the American Professional line of guitars be introduced, replacing the American Standard guitars that were introduced in the 80s. 2018 would see the introduction of the most recent new Fender model, the Meteora, and in this same year the range of Mexican Standard guitars would be replaced by the still Mexican-made Player series. In 2019, Fender would buy Bigsby from Gretsch, and in 2020 the American Pro 2 line is introduced, upgrading and developing from the original American Professional line. In November of 2021, Fender would buy PreSonus, a company that makes audio equipment, and that brings us up to 2024, and a few months ago, when Fender would update the Player series into the Player 2 series. So there you go, there's a brief history of the Fender Guitar Company. I've definitely missed out a lot of models, so drop me a comment down below what your favourite model from Fender history is. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.